Major funding for this program was provided by the Batchelor Foundation, encouraging people to preserve and protect America's underwater resources.
The oceans were once an abundant resource, holding what seemed to be a limitless supply of seafood. But today, roughly 80% of major marine fish stocks are either depleted or overfished.
The worldwide seafood landings of wild-caught seafood essentially maxed out in 1990. So at a time when doctors are recommending we eat more seafood, it's imperative that we come up with other ways to supply that seafood than going after the remaining fish in the sea.
One solution is to farm fish and crustaceans.
Aquaculture is farming the sea, just as agriculture is farming on land.
But just like agriculture, aquaculture can come at a cost.
The issue now is, can we farm it in a way that does not cause much harm to the marine environment?
Is aquaculture the way of the future? Can it help meet the ever-growing demand for seafood in a sustainable way? The farming of fish and crustaceans is not a new concept.
Aquaculture right now is supplying 35 to 40% of the seafood that we eat.
But the majority of that seafood doesn't come from U.S. waters.
Our second largest natural resource trade deficit is seafood, second only to oil. And that's just a staggering statistic.
Right now, over 80% of the seafood that we eat in this country is imported. And so that seafood is either being caught or produced in other countries. We know that the inspection process for imported seafood is very limited, and we know that there's contaminants that are coming in with that seafood.
Foreign aquaculture operations in Asia and South America have been criticized for using large amounts of antibiotics and other drugs, creating a potential health risk for the consumer. Others have caused environmental problems.
Basically, large areas of mangrove forest along coastal waters have been bulldozed to make way for shrimp farms and fish farms. And so you have a choice. You can either have more aquaculture under strict regulations in this country, or we could continue to buy seafood from other countries which have a lot less regulations and we know are causing a lot more pollution.
There are many different types of aquaculture, and much is being done in the United States to make the farming of seafood more environmentally friendly. In Cedar Key, a small town in Florida's Big Bend area, clam farming is big business.
Allowing our fishermen to become clam farmers has allowed us to continue as a working waterfront.
The industry got started in 1994 after the Florida net ban put many local fishermen out of business.
The infrastructure for this new industry came about through federally funded job retraining programs, placing about 200 fishermen into the clam farming business. You don't require expensive waterfront property. You're leasing coastal submerged lands from the state of Florida at a fairly nominal fee.
Cedar Key is a perfect location for clam farming. The town's rural character and the lack of development have kept the local waters of the Gulf of Mexico pollution-free, yet rich enough in nutrients that the filter-feeding clams need to survive.
There's no such thing as clam chow. In other words, Mother Nature is providing the food for your crop. And if you don't have adequate nutrients and phytoplankton in the water, you're going to have limited growth and production.
Farming clams from start to finish is a labor-intensive job, which begins at one of the local hatcheries.
You're looking at hard clams, a scientific name Mercenaria mercenaria, and these are our broodstock clams that we use to spawn and hatch out new baby clams. The broodstock came from actually a New England wild clam. Each clam is capable of producing about 2 million eggs. In the wild, maybe only 1 or 2 of those eggs would actually become fertilized because nature's natural selection would eliminate most of those. In here, we create the ideal conditions for most of the eggs to become fertilized. So we could get as much as 10 or 20 million fertilized baby clams in just one spawn.
This is the very act of domestication. We're maximizing nature's potential.
The farmers at hatcheries like Southern Cross recreate the natural conditions clams need to spawn. After each spawning event, the fertilized eggs are moved into larvae tanks.
Now, there is approximately 11 million baby clam larvae in that tank as we speak, and they're about 40 times smaller than the naked eye can see, and they'll sit in there 5 days to a week, and they're swimming around as clam larvae. And after about a week or so, they'll actually develop a shell and a foot. And it's much like a caterpillar in a cocoon becoming a butterfly. It goes through a metamorphosis, a very critical stage in their life. And once they do that, they'll sink to the bottom of the water column. They are now a hard clam. Clams eat algae, and we grow algae for the clams. They're filter feeders, and when they're this small, we feed them a specific type of algae that is easier for them to eat. They go through hundreds of gallons of algae a day, and in order to keep up with their voracious appetite, we have to grow algae every day. These are approximately 1 month old, and they're 1 millimeter in size. There's approximately 250,000 clams in this one silo alone.
Once the clams reach a certain size, they are ready to be moved to silos on a floating dock outside.
After they get out of the hatchery, this is the first time they're introduced to our wild natural algae. Their water's pumped right out of the Gulf here, so they'll switch over from the food that we've made in there to this food, and we don't have to feed them anymore.
The clams will stay at the floating dock for several more weeks, until they reach roughly the size of an aspirin tablet.
The clams are sieved. The small stuff will fall through, the big stuff will come down here. The big stuff will take out to the leases tomorrow. So they'll be planted out in the wild. This is the final step in the whole nursery part of the equation.
Once they've reached this size, the clams are put into bags and sold to farmers who will plant them on their leased plots in the Gulf of Mexico.
There's about 750 acres of state-owned submerged lands that are dedicated to shellfish aquaculture leases just here in Cedar Key.
One of the farmers is Bobby Witt, who buys the little clams from a hatchery and then plants them on his lease. Bobby, who leases 7 acres from the state, has been in the clamming business for 14 years. The warm temperatures of the Gulf make the clams grow faster than they would in New England, and it allows the farmers to plant and harvest year-round. Bobby says it takes roughly 2 years for the clams to grow into a marketable product.
It's typical farming, just like farming on land. I try to rotate my planting, so I've got something to harvest all the time, which isn't always easy to do.
Once the bags are planted on the bottom, Mother Nature takes care of the rest.
We tout ourselves as a very green industry, and that's because we do not have the use of feeds, fertilizers to stimulate any kind of growth, antibiotics, pesticides, herbicides. In fact, these would be detrimental to our shellfish crop.
And this is our product before we take them to the dock. He's about the first marketable size. They use him for all sorts of clams over pasta and whatnot as a pasta clam. But our optimum size is more the 1-inch clam. That's what we're after, the inch to the 1.1 roughly. These are more your primary marketable clams would be these. Once again, because they bring the money.
Once his clams have grown to market size, Bobby can harvest them on demand and take them back to the dock.
They'll get rewashed and tumbled. Then I'll sort them again as they come out of the tumbler, and then I look at them one more time before I sell them to the wholesaler.
In the early years of the industry, it took some convincing of the local fishermen to get into the business.
I was a net fisherman, and after they banned the nets, I was retrained as a clam farmer. I didn't have a whole bunch of faith that it would work.
I was a little more positive. Most people were more skeptical. I did like the idea of staying working on the water because the alternative was to get a job on the hill, of course. So I pursued it because it looked like an opportunity.
It definitely works. The Cedar Key's great for it. It's helped it to retain some of its fishing heritage, and there's no doubt that it's a viable way to make a living.
The first ever USDA aquaculture census conducted in 1998 showed that Florida was one of the leading producers of farm-raised hard clams by volume. And we know from our state surveys that Cedar Key is one of the dominant production areas. Florida produces about 190 million clams. I think that was based on a 2007 survey, and it does fluctuate from year to year. That equates to about something like $19 million dockside, but that's not all of the story. We have the hatcheries that produce the seed. We have seamstresses that make the clam bags, boat builders that specialize in clam work skiffs, and wholesalers that distribute statewide and nationwide. So the economic footprint is obviously much larger than the dockside value. Florida was estimated at something close to $50 million. Very important.
And I'm trying to get them washed up real good.
Clamming provides a source of revenue to Cedar Key and other communities around the state, and it does so without much of a negative environmental impact.
Most of the jobs are out here on the water, so the local governments and the county government is very interested in keeping the water clean and natural and normal here to support this industry.
Clam farming is a dramatic success story, but it's built upon one species. And so we're basically a monoculture industry. So we are starting to look at what other alternative species could be cultured alongside the hard clam and offer an alternative marketing opportunity.
The northern hard